Late-stage cancer, not much time left to live. My final wish before I die is to never love this man again. If there is a next life. I thought he would be happy when I'm gone, but I never expected him to ultimately choose to end his life and join me. Tick-tock. Thud. It's midnight. Betty stared blankly at the gradually melting sky-blue cake on the table. The only candle inserted on the cake had burned out. Her 25th birthday silently came to an end. She walked to the table, looking at the forgotten cake, and used her index finger to scoop a piece, putting it into her mouth. Happy birthday, she whispered to herself. Then, without hesitation, she threw the whole cake into the trash can. 1:30 a.m. He came back. Betty smiled as she looked at the man who walked back through the door. You're back, Dan. A different gaze fell upon the woman on the couch, reeking of alcohol, and his brows furrowed, displeased. Can you do something serious other than drinking? Betty shook the wine glass in her hand and lightly chuckled. Drinking is serious business. She got off the couch, swaying, and walked towards him. Alcohol is a good thing. Come have a sip. She brought the glass to his lips, looking at him with blurred eyes. Come on, taste it. The man squinted his eyes, pushing her hand away. You should go to sleep. Betty stumbled for a moment, almost falling to the ground, spilling most of the wine from the glass with that push. She became a bit more sober. She placed the glass on the table, ran her hand through her hair, and then turned to look at him, a faint smile on her lips. Today is my birthday. Hearing those words, Dan's gaze flickered for a moment, then returned to normal. Since it's your birthday, of course, there should be a gift. She exhaled softly. If you won't give me one, then let me give you one. Saying that, she took out a document from the drawer next to the couch and handed it to him. This is my gift to you. The man's gaze fell on the cover of the document. Divorce agreement. The words entered his sight. His brows furrowed, and he asked in a low voice, What game are you playing now? My father bound you to me for so many years with a scheme, and it has been unfair to you. Weren't you always thinking about your first love? Go find her. She stuffed the divorce agreement into his hand, and before he could react, she tiptoed and kissed his lips abruptly. Within seconds, he forcefully pushed her away. This time, Betty truly felt the dull pain of her body colliding with the floor. Dan didn't expect her to fall. She looked quite weak. His brows furrowed slightly, but he didn't help her up. Betty endured the throbbing pain in her arm and narrowed her gaze. As a married couple, we've reached such a point. It's quite a failure. It seems like we really aren't meant to be lifelong companions. Dan's voice remained cold. If you had thought that way back then, we wouldn't have entangled each other until now. It's my fault. Betty forced a smile, her mouth twitching. This guilt can only be atoned with death. Dan's lips curled into a cold smirk. Are you willing to die? Betty's long lashes trembled, her voice slightly lower. If I die, in the next life, I will never love you again. Let's see when you're dead. Dan withdrew his gaze, turned around, and left. The door slammed shut. He walked away again. The curve of Betty's lips gradually eased. She held her throbbing left arm and stood up. He still despised her so much. She bitterly smiled, sitting on the couch. Betty took out another document from the drawer, a medical report. Late-stage cancer, a suffocating phrase written on the last page of the report. She closed her eyes, opened them after a while, and then tore the report apart. The shreds of paper scattered on the ground. Betty looked at the wedding ring on her ring finger, gently rubbing her fingertip against it. Slowly, she took off the wedding ring and placed it on the table. The next morning, Betty packed up all her belongings and threw them into the car. Without even having breakfast, she drove away from the villa. She drove forward, gradually leaving the city behind, and entered the coastal highway. Opening the car window, the chilly wind blew against her face. Betty squinted her eyes, gazing directly at the sun. Never again, Dan. She turned the steering wheel to the right, loosening her grip on the wheel, and stepped on the accelerator to the maximum. Bang! The car crashed into the steep cliff on the right side at high speed. The front of the car was severely deformed, and fresh red blood flowed from underneath the car seat. D Company, on the 60th floor. Secretary Gill arrived at the company early in the morning, preparing for the meeting. At exactly 9 o'clock, the CEO returned to his office on time, and Gill, as usual, brought in a cup of strong coffee. Sir, the video conference with Weiss starts at 9:30. The meeting documents have been prepared and placed on your desk. Dan pinched his brow with one hand and nodded faintly. Gill, ever observant, noticed immediately that something was missing from the CEO's finger, right, the wedding ring. The wedding ring on his left ring finger was gone, leaving only a faint red mark. Gill was slightly surprised. Although the CEO never held his wife in high regard, he never took off his wedding ring. Why today? Seeing her hesitation to leave, Dan glanced at her. Is there something else? No. Gill nodded slightly and turned to leave. Around noon, when Betty, who had faithfully delivered lunch for the past 5 years, didn't show up today, Gill seemed to have guessed something and quickly ordered takeout for the CEO. 30 minutes later, the takeout arrived, and Gill brought it into the CEO's office. President Smith, let's have lunch first, Gill said as he placed the takeout on the desk and left. Dan finished his work, and it was already 10 minutes later. He opened the lunch box and took a bite, his brows furrowing slightly. The taste of this meal was different from what he usually had. After a few more bites, he set it aside. His phone on the table vibrated, but his gaze remained fixed on the files in front of him. He picked up the phone without looking and answered the call. Dan, are you done with work? Upon hearing the familiar voice, Dan glanced at the screen, a slight smile forming at the corner of his mouth. Almost. Then let's have dinner together tonight. Dan looked at the documents on the table and replied softly, okay. The other person hung up with a hint of joy. Dan picked up his pace, finished reading the file in his hand, confirmed that all the work for the day was completed, and left the company. Hyatt International Hotel. Dan's car approached from afar, and Kathy adjusted her dress, smiling as she waited for him to get out of the car. Dan! Dan handed the car keys to the doorman and walked towards her. Have you been here long? Kathy naturally linked her arm with his and whispered, No, I just arrived. There was a momentary stiffness in Dan's arm, but it quickly relaxed. The two entered the French restaurant on the 3rd floor of Hyatt International Hotel. With the most gentlemanly gesture, Dan pulled out a chair for Kathy and ordered several dishes she liked. Kathy seemed to be in a good mood, a smile lingering on her lips. This morning, she had contacted a member of the staff at Dan's house, who informed her that Dan and Betty had a big fight in the early hours, and Dan had left the villa in his car, while Betty had packed her bags and left early in the morning. Betty's family had fallen apart, and Dan, who had gone from a poor young man with nothing to a successful business tycoon, was no longer bound by Betty. Exquisite dishes were served one by one, and Kathy maintained the appropriate poise of a young lady, occasionally picking some food for him. Dan looked at her intently and asked with concern, Are you feeling better? Kathy gracefully cut into her steak and softly replied, Much better. Just some stomach pain, it's an old problem. As long as I eat on time, it won't bother me. I remember when we were studying, you didn't have any stomach issues. Kathy's movements paused for a moment, and she smiled as she met his gaze. Back then, you took such good care of me, how could I get sick? Dan's gaze softened. He didn't take care of you. Kathy set down her knife and fork, her brows slightly furrowing. Betty occupied 5 years of your life, and I reluctantly spent 5 years by someone else's side. But we both know that you can't force feelings. We deeply love each other, and if it weren't for Betty's interference, we could have been together 5 years ago. Dan seemed to recall the unbearable experiences from 5 years ago, his face darkened. I'm sorry. Kathy stood up and walked to his side. Bending down, she wrapped her hands around the back of his neck. No, you're not at fault. It was Betty and her father who forced us with their power. At that time, we had no authority or influence to resist. She looked into his eyes, her gaze finally landing on his thin lips, slowly pressing down. In an instant, a familiar and annoying voice echoed in Dan's mind. Dan, after we got married, you can't do anything that would hurt me, like hugging, kissing, or anything like that with other girls. Do you understand? Almost instinctively, Dan turned his head, avoiding her kiss. Kathy's face froze. She bit her lip, standing upright with a sense of disappointment. I've offended you, forgetting that you are a married man. We're divorced, Dan said. As he said those words, Dan unconsciously touched a certain spot on his left ring finger. The ring that had been worn for 5 years was no longer there, but the imprint it left behind made his heart skip a beat. Kathy's heart filled with joy, but her face pretended to be shocked. Really? You're divorced? Dan stood up, pulling her back to her original position. Whispering, Yes, we are. Kathy placed her hands on top of his, her smile radiant. That's great, Dan. You no longer have to force yourself to stay by her side. She held his hand tightly. This is a good thing, we should celebrate. Dan shrugged. It's not a big deal, no need to celebrate. Of course we should celebrate, Kathy said playfully. I've been waiting for this day for 5 years. Dan, let's celebrate together, even if it's for me. Seeing her bright smile, Dan didn't want to disappoint her, so he went along. On the 8th floor of Hyatt International Hotel, there was a lavish nightclub. The famous young gentlemen of the city liked to come here for entertainment. After finishing dinner, Kathy took Dan to the 8th floor. Originally, she was planning to invite Dan's other friends, but it turned out they were all there on the 8th floor drinking. Kathy couldn't help but feel excited and took Dan directly to their private room. Deafening music emanated from the room. Kathy almost clung to Dan, her hands tightly holding his arm, as if declaring her sovereignty. The friends cheered, their glasses constantly refilled and emptied. Eventually, Dan became so drunk that he couldn't stand straight. Dazed and confused, he squinted at his watch and mumbled, "It's midnight. I have to go home." That woman, Betty, wouldn't let him come home late, always nagging at him, so annoying. Kathy had been by his side all along and naturally heard his muttering. Her face darkened slightly. Her hands wrapped around his slender waist. She softly coaxed, "Dan, you're divorced now. No one will restrain you anymore, so you don't need to abide by any agreements of not drinking or coming home early." Divorced? Dan closed his eyes and smiled. Yeah, we're divorced. Divorced. Unsteadily, he took a drink handed to him by someone else and finished it in one go. A few drops of liquid slid down his mouth, down his throat. Kathy gazed at this enchanting and captivating man, unable to help but bite her lip. Okay, she timely blocked the drinks offered by others. Let's stop here tonight. Dan is drunk, I'll take him to rest. Kathy struggled to support Dan, shaking her head with a smile. No need, you guys continue. I can handle it myself. After saying that, she supported Dan and slowly walked out of the private room. Dan followed Kathy out of the private room without saying a word, and they took the elevator to the 60th floor. Come on, Dan, be careful. Kathy helped Dan to one of the room doors and took out the prepared room key to open the door. Come in first. The two entered the room, and Kathy helped him lie down on the bed. Just as she was about to take off his coat, Dan suddenly sat up, pushed her away, and his profound gaze revealed little emotion. Kathy paused for a moment and tentatively asked, "What's wrong?" "I'll book another room." Dan stood up, his groggy head making him sway a few times, almost losing his balance. Dan stumbled to the door and coincidentally bumped into the hotel manager walking in the corridor. After the manager opened a room for him, he walked into the newly opened room alone and casually closed the door. Kathy's misty eyes gradually turned cold, eventually revealing resentment. They were already divorced, yet he was still remaining faithful to that woman? The next day, Kathy tidied up her feelings of disappointment, put on a perfect smile on her face, and energetically held Dan's arm as they took the elevator down from the 60th floor. In the hotel lobby, they encountered a familiar face. The magnificent lobby was bustling with people. Kathy held on to Dan, smiling as she looked at someone not far away. The lobby manager of this hotel was Anne, Betty's childhood friend whom she grew up with. She was dressed in a black professional suit, standing straight there, her gaze coldly landing on the embracing couple. The passing staff occasionally greeted Anne, and she merely nodded slightly in response. Dan looked at the woman in front of him and subconsciously wanted to retract his arm, but in the next second, he remembered that he was already divorced from Betty, so he didn't move anymore. Anne's lips curved with a mocking smile. Mr. Smith seems to have quite the good fortune, one at home and several on the outside, enjoying it to the fullest. However, sometimes having too much good fortune may be hard to digest. I wonder if Mr. Smith is feeling a little overwhelmed? Dan's gaze slightly darkened, but he remained silent. Kathy restrained her smile, took a step forward, and stood in front of Dan in a protective stance. And the affairs between the three of us are none of your business. 5 years ago, it was Betty who used her family's power to force Dan to marry her. If it weren't for her persistent pursuit, Dan and I wouldn't have been separated for so long. If it weren't for her stubbornness, Dan wouldn't have been slandered behind his back by the people in City A, and he wouldn't have to bear such an undeserved reputation. And provocatively looked at Dan. Undeserved reputation? What are you referring to? Living off women? Depending on women? Or being heartless? Shut up! Kathy glared at Anne angrily. I know best what kind of person Dan is, and I won't allow you to defame him like this. You won't allow? By what authority won't you allow it? Anne mocked. Kathy said to Anne, Dan and I knew each other first. Betty was the third party who came between us. Is that so? Anne sneered. I remember it was you who dumped Dan for a wealthy second generation and left him. Kathy glanced at Dan guiltily and hurriedly explained, if it wasn't for Betty getting in between us, there's no way I would have left Dan. The order seems to be reversed, and taunted. Even a dog would wag its tail after 5 years, let alone Betty, who loved Dan with all her heart and soul, only to be ignored by him in the end. Anne's gaze didn't even linger on Kathy, she just stared mockingly at Dan. I hope you really haven't fallen for her, because once you realize what you've lost, you'll understand the true meaning of regret. Every time Anne thought of the lifeless body she saw in the hospital, she wished she could tear apart the two people in front of her with her own hands. The person who used to be so bright and kind ended up in such a state, and she couldn't convince herself not to hate. Dan met her gaze with indifference and spoke in a cold voice, I don't love her. And sneered, I hope you remember what you said today and never regret it for the rest of your life. With that, Anne coldly walked away, leaving behind her words. Stop! Kathy turned around to call her back and couldn't be bothered. And walked away nonchalantly. Forget it, Kathy wanted to say something else, but Dan interrupted in a low voice, let's go. Dan first took Kathy back to her apartment before driving back to the office. Once he returned to the company, Dan resumed his busy routine as usual. The hangover from the previous night gave him a slight headache. After the meeting, he took a short break and then had his secretary bring him a cup of strong coffee. While waiting for the coffee, he took out his personal phone that had been silent all night and scrolled through it. Besides the information sent by Kathy, there was nothing else. Kathy had invited him to have dinner together in the evening. Dan thought for a moment and replied with a message saying he had something else to do and suggested they reschedule. After sending the message, he went through all the information and missed calls on his phone, but didn't see that familiar series of numbers. For some reason, he felt a strange sense of disappointment. He lowered his gaze, silently pondering for a moment. When Gil walked in with the coffee, Mr. Smith, here's your coffee. Dan took one last look at his phone, then looked up at Gil, feigning indifference. Has Betty called? Gil was momentarily taken aback, then replied, no, she hasn't. Dan lowered his gaze again, not saying anything. The fact that the CEO would actively ask about Betty today couldn't help but make Gil feel extremely curious. After finishing the hot coffee, Dan sat down, put his phone aside, and immersed himself in another round of work. At noon, Gil arranged a boxed lunch for him. Dan took a few bites, his eyebrows furrowing once again. Where was this boxed lunch ordered from? Washing Hotel. Gil thought for a moment, hesitatingly asked, "Is it that the food doesn't suit your taste? Should I order another one for you? The previous one and this one are from the same restaurant." "No. From now on, order from the previous one." Gil glanced at the CEO, but didn't dare to speak. Dan glanced at her, his voice cold. "Can't you do that?" Gil struggled internally, closed her eyes for a moment, and confessed, "The previous meals were all sent by Madam." Gil nervously continued, "For the past few years, your lunch has always been sent by Madam, rain or shine, always punctual. Because she was afraid you wouldn't eat, Madam specifically instructed me not to let you know that she sent the food, so I didn't tell you." "I'm sorry, Mr. Smith, I shouldn't have taken it upon myself." Dan didn't say anything, just waved his hand, signaling her to leave. Dan looked at the boxed lunch in front of him, and memories of the beautifully arranged meals he had eaten in the past came to mind. The taste wasn't particularly amazing, but it had a homely deliciousness to it. He opened his phone again and checked, but there was still no message. After a moment of silent contemplation, he put down his phone and immersed himself back into his work. By the time he finished everything, it was already late. He looked at the time, thought for a moment, and then picked up his car keys and walked out. He went to the parking lot, got his car, and drove back to the villa. The house had been without its owner for 2 days now. The servants and a few housemates were diligently taking care of the villa. They were happy to see Dan return. "Sir, you're back. I'll have someone prepare dinner for you in the kitchen." Dan took off his coat and handed it to one of the maids, then asked the servant, "Is Madam at home?" The servant shook her head, worriedly saying, "Madam left in her car yesterday morning and hasn't returned yet." Dan said in a calm voice, "Have them prepare dinner." "All right." Dan went upstairs and returned to their room. He walked around the room and realized that it was much emptier now. All of her belongings were gone. Her clothes in the wardrobe, bags, shoes, all disappeared. Even the skincare and makeup products on the dressing table were swept away, and the woman who had waited for him countless nights over the past 5 years was also gone. Betty had completely left this place, left him. Dan looked at the empty bedroom, and an indescribable feeling filled his heart. He sat down on the sofa, his gaze falling on the wedding ring gleaming in the light. This ring used to be a pair with the one he wore. He picked up the ring, and in his deep, unfathomable eyes, waves gently swept by. He suddenly felt a sense of congestion in his chest. This emotion was too strange. Dan clenched the ring in his hand, feeling a sense of confusion deep within. Could it be, is she serious about divorcing him? The next day, Dan returned to the company on time. The morning meeting was still in progress when Kathy approached him. At 11:30, when the meeting ended, Dan returned to his office and saw Kathy, who had come unannounced. He was slightly surprised and asked, "Why are you here?" Kathy put down the coffee she was holding and walked up to him. "I couldn't arrange a meal with a busy person yesterday, so I had to come in person today." Dan sat back in his chair, looking at the mountain of documents on his desk, and helplessly said, "I might not be able to do it so soon." Kathy empathetically replied, "It's okay, I'll wait for you to finish." Time passed slowly, and without realizing it, an hour had gone by. Dan finally managed to handle some urgent files and was about to take Kathy out for lunch when his phone rang. Glancing at the caller ID, it was an unfamiliar number. He hesitated for a moment, but decided to answer it. This was his private phone number, known to very few people. The voice on the other end of the phone was cold. "Dan, this is Anne. Come to the police station now." Dan asked calmly, "What's the matter?" Besides Betty, he had no other connection with Anne. Anne's voice was as cold as ice. Betty's body is going to be cremated, and the cremation process requires your signature. The cremation process requires the signature of a deceased person's relative. Betty's parents had already passed away, and besides Dan, she had no other relatives. Although she had signed the divorce agreement, they hadn't completed the final divorce procedure yet. Therefore, legally, Dan was still her only relative. Dan narrowed his eyes and asked, "What are you talking about? A body cremation?" And repeated coldly, "I said, Betty's body is going to be cremated, and it requires your signature." Dan clearly didn't believe her and said in a low voice, "Is this some kind of joke?" "Whether it's a joke or not, you'll find out when you come." After saying that, and hung up the phone. A sardonic smile appeared on Dan's lips. After hiding for 2 days, she finally dared to show up. Kathy approached Dan and asked softly, "Dan, whose call was that?" Dan snapped out of his thoughts and apologized. "I'm sorry, Kathy, I have some last-minute matters to attend to, and I won't be able to have lunch with you." Kathy's expression froze for a moment, but she quickly put on an understanding smile and said, "It's all right, work is important. We can have lunch together another time." "Yes, sounds good." He went to the parking lot, got his car, and drove towards the police station. Arriving at the police station, he expected to see Betty with a triumphant look on her face. He had always believed that this was just a game played by Betty and just to keep him by her side, but there was none. Arriving at the police station, he only saw Anne standing among a few police officers, looking grief-stricken. He furrowed his brow and walked towards her. Anne glanced at him indifferently and said to the officers beside her, "He is Betty's husband, he can sign." Anne's eyes were red, as if she had just been crying, and her voice was hoarse. Impatiently, Dan asked, "What are you all doing?" One of the officers patted Dan's shoulder and comforted him, "Our condolences." Dan's pupils contracted slightly, not fully understanding the meaning behind his words. "Let me take you to see the body first, to confirm." He followed the officer. They arrived at a room where there was a bed, and on the bed lay a person completely covered in white cloth from head to toe. "The body has been here for 2 days and 2 nights. With the current hot weather, the injured areas have started to decompose, and livor mortis has appeared. It won't be long before it starts to smell, so we recommend cremation as soon as possible." "A body?" Dan said, "I don't quite understand what you're talking about." The officer explained softly, "Your wife had a car accident 2 days ago and died on the spot." Dan was stunned by this absurd news, feeling at a loss. He subconsciously clenched the hand hanging by his side. How is this possible? He didn't believe that the person lying on the bed was Betty. Step by step, he walked to the edge of the bed, his fingertips touching the white cloth. Just as he was about to uncover it, an unfathomable fear suddenly surged within him. He hesitated for a moment before slowly lifting the white cloth. Dan stared blankly at the woman in front of him, someone he was so familiar with that she was practically etched into his bones. He didn't come back to his senses for a long time, just silently gazing at her, speechless. Dan recalled what Anne had said before, "Are you saying she committed suicide?" and coldly smirked, "There weren't that many accidents, she was just targeted by your indifference." Her body was targeted by a terminal illness, and she couldn't survive anymore. "Dan, Betty gave her heart and soul to you, never doing anything to hurt you. You thought she was restricting your freedom, but she knew nothing about it, yet she had to bear all your hatred and anger because of it." Dan stood there in a daze, his gaze lowered. Dan glanced at the confirmation document in front of him, his heart slightly constricted. He slowly signed his name on the document. Dan watched as the body was pushed into the crematorium, gradually being engulfed and consumed by the fierce flames. After the cremation, the staff at the crematorium packed the ashes and brought them out. Anne instinctively reached out to take them, but Dan intercepted her halfway. Dan held the urn of ashes, looking at Anne indifferently. "She is my wife, and I will take care of her affairs. No need." And stood in front of him, saying that as she tried to snatch it away, but Dan held the urn tightly and moved aside. "She is my wife, and I will handle her affairs," Dan emphasized. Dan returned to the villa with the urn of ashes. Holding the urn, he entered the room. Dan, who had not slept all night, had stubble on his chin and looked slightly tired. After a moment of silence, he picked up the urn of ashes and stood up, opening the door to leave. As he was going downstairs, Dan unexpectedly missed a step and fell. Instinctively, he held the urn tightly in his arms, afraid of any slightest impact on it. Carefully, Dan placed the urn on the table in the middle of the living room and personally checked all the items needed for the funeral. Betty's burial was scheduled for the next morning, and there were still many things to prepare. And arrived early in the morning, and not long after, Kathy and other friends arrived one after another. Dan's gaze remained fixed on the urn placed on the table, silent and calm. Kathy glanced at the table, pursed her lips, and suddenly said, "Perhaps this is the best outcome. She will no longer be saddened by love that she couldn't have. And Dan, you and I will no longer be hindered." Anne's eyes filled with mocking glances as she coldly stared at Kathy, her voice unusually cold. "The original wife hasn't even been buried yet. The mistress dares to come here and celebrate the future. That's enough." Just as Kathy was about to retort loudly, Dan suddenly interrupted in a deep voice. His face showed no emotion, and he calmly said to Kathy, "You should go back first." Kathy took a step forward to explain, "Dan, I didn't mean anything else. I just thought this would be a relief for the three of us. I know you feel guilty, but you can't blame yourself for her death." Dan looked up at Kathy, his voice much darker than before, "Leave immediately." Kathy reached out to grab his arm, but he sidestepped her. And then Dan took care of all the preparations for the funeral together. Dan looked at the meal the servant had placed on the table and suddenly remembered the familiar taste of home-cooked dishes that had unknowingly invaded all his taste buds over the past 5 years. His gaze returned to the wedding photo with her smiling face. "Dan, after we get married, you can't do anything that would hurt me. Hugging, kissing, those things should only be done with me, understand?" After they got married, on his first birthday, she had personally knitted a light gray scarf for him. On his second birthday, she traveled to his hometown to learn the local specialty snacks and made them for him. On his third birthday, at exactly midnight, she made a bowl of longevity noodles and brought it to him. On his fourth birthday, suddenly, he couldn't find any memories related to her. Dan furrowed his brow, trying hard to remember. Yes, on his fourth birthday, he didn't spend it with her. That day, Kathy called him crying, and in a moment of impulse, he drove to another city to see her. He stood up and walked to the closet, pulling out the hand-knitted scarf she had given him from the corner. As he touched the scarf in his hand, he couldn't help but feel a hint of sadness deep within his heart. On the day of the funeral, a light drizzle fell from the sky. And had arrived early and stood silently in front of the tombstone, holding a black umbrella. After many people finished paying their respects at the grave, they left. In the end, only Dan and remained in front of the cemetery. Dan's gaze was too deep, and others couldn't discern any trace of emotion from his eyes. "When did she develop cancer?" And took a step forward, bending down to gently wipe the rainwater off the photo with her sleeve. "A week ago, we had plans to have dinner together. She suddenly experienced severe abdominal pain and passed out. I took her to the hospital, and the diagnosis report confirming her suicide was obtained the day before. She called me and said some strange things, and when I asked her what happened, she brushed it off." Dan, compared to the pain brought by her terminal illness, what made her most desperate was that you didn't love her. Dan didn't know how he returned to the villa. He ignored everything and walked straight upstairs, returning to his room. There were no longer any belongings of Betty in the room. Dan lay on the bed, and it seemed like something was hidden under her pillow, something slightly hard. It was a notebook. Flipping open the notebook, it contained many things related to him. Dan's fingertips trembled slightly as he stared at each page, flipping through them. When he reached the last page, his eyes inexplicably turned sour. The last page of the notebook was what she wrote before the incident: "I want to spend a birthday with Dan." That day, he seemed to have returned home after midnight. His heart throbbed with a hidden pain as he carefully recalled the bits and pieces of what happened that day. and said she received the diagnosis report on her birthday, and that night, she gave him a divorce agreement. She said, "If I die, in the next life, I won't love you again," and he said, "Let's talk about it when you're dead." The notebook in his hand suddenly fell onto the mattress, and all the strength seemed to drain from Dan's body. After the funeral, Dan changed. He continued to go to work on time, seemingly normal, but as his secretary, Gil, noticed his abnormality. He used to be punctual for work but rarely left on time, but now, as soon as it was time to leave, he would abandon everything and go home. And at lunchtime, the CEO actually brought his own meal, and the lunchbox he brought was exactly the same as the one the CEO's wife used to bring to the company, and several times, he would suddenly ask if his wife had called. At first, she thought that the CEO was accustomed to his wife's daily phone calls to check in, but later, she slowly realized that it wasn't the case. Like now, with his head down, Dan, immersed in his work, asked casually during the brief moment when Gil brought in the coffee, "Did my wife call today?" Gil's hand holding the coffee trembled, and she replied, "No." Dan lowered his gaze, murmuring to himself, still angry. Gil looked at the man who had already returned to his work, shocked. She always felt that something was off with the CEO. He goes to work and comes home as usual every day. When he returns, he has someone deliver dinner to his room, and the dinner always has to be prepared for 2 people. At night, he often goes to the wine cabinet and brings a bottle of good wine upstairs. There are also 2 wine glasses prepared. On this night, Dan, as usual, took a bottle of red wine upstairs but suddenly paused at the stairs. Dan glanced to the side, and a faint smile appeared on his lips. "Prepare some appetizers for the lady." "Yes." The servant's attention was focused on the appetizers behind, and it took her a while to realize the problem. The servant was taken aback. Prepare for the lady?" "Sir." Dan's arms still wrapped around his gaze, not shifting from his side. He softly responded, Dan turned his head to look at the servant, the doting expression still on his face. "The lady likes to have some appetizers with her drink." "Go prepare some." The servant rubbed her eyes, her shock deepening on her face. "Sir, who are you holding?" Dan slightly furrowed his brow, a hint of displeasure in his eyes. "Can't you see? Betty, such a big person, right here." After saying that, he looked back to his side, fell silent for a moment, and began talking to himself. I know. I don't blame her. It's just that you're standing right here and she didn't even see you." Apart from Dan's occasional confusing actions, life seemed to have not changed at all. He often gave off the feeling that Betty was still alive. He treated this imaginary wife very well. He became more and more accommodating to the lady. The meals were prepared in the kitchen according to her preferences, and the sofa in the living room was changed to her favorite color. Every move and gesture spoke of Mr. Smith's longing for his wife. Kathy somehow learned about Dan's current situation and broke into the villa to find him. Dan saw Kathy, said nothing, and just placed the dessert he was holding aside, but there was no one sitting on that side of the sofa. She looked at him incredulously. "Betty is already dead. How long are you going to deceive yourself?" She tightly grabbed his arm with both hands. Dan coldly pulled her hands away. "You should go back. Don't come here again." Betty didn't like other women coming to the house. Kathy stood up. "Can't you wake up? Betty has been dead for a long time. She can't see your guilt and regret." Dan's expression remained emotionless. He reached out and touched something nearby as if comforting something and faced Kathy. "You should go back." Kathy stared at him blankly. "What do you mean? I love Betty. What about me? What am I to you?" Kathy's eyes widened. "You bastard." After Kathy left, Dan looked back at the sofa, but the person with the gentle smile had already disappeared. He searched everywhere but couldn't find a trace of her. Dan murmured, "Are you angry?" Suddenly, his stomach contracted, and he rushed into the bathroom, feeling sick. A maid saw him and turned around, taking out her phone and making a call. "Kathy, you should come back. Miss. Mr. Smith is continuously vomiting." The focused maid didn't notice the man who walked in behind her until the cold air seeped into her body and mind. The maid finally realized, "Sir." Dan's icy gaze fixed on her without saying a word. The maid was terrified, sweating coldly, and stammered, "I'm sorry, sir, I didn't mean to. It was Kathy. She asked me to report everything about you and Madam in the villa. On Madam's birthday, she asked me to secretly put some photos in Madam's room. I refused, but she later sent them to Madam's phone." Dan's gaze narrowed. "What photos?" The trembling maid said, "Intimate photos of her with you and a pregnancy test report." Dan's gaze turned even colder. He had Gil take back the villa he had provided for Kathy and cancelled all the cards he had opened for her. Overnight, Kathy lost everything. She searched everywhere like a headless fly, the company, the villa, even the restaurants and entertainment venues he frequented, but she couldn't find a trace of him. She was filled with rage, like a mad woman with nowhere to vent, until one day, she ran into that maid on the street and finally understood. Dan still lived a monotonous and dull life between the company and the villa. Every day when he came home, he had someone prepare 2 dinners to be delivered to his room. Occasionally, he would still go downstairs and bring a bottle of red wine back to his room with 2 glasses as always. 1 year later, it was Betty's death anniversary. Dan brought a handful of her favorite baby's breath to visit her. He finally realized the fact that she was no longer there. Dan quietly stayed there for the whole day, not saying anything, until nightfall when he finally got up to leave. On his way back, it started pouring rain. He saw a truck coming towards him uncontrollably from the adjacent lane. His subconscious wanted to turn the steering wheel, but in that split second, he remembered the lifeless woman he saw in the police station last year. He let go of the steering wheel. "It's fine." Bang! A deafening sound filled the air, and Dan plunged into darkness. Faint and intermittent voices reached his ears, some familiar yet somewhat unfamiliar. His head throbbed, and Dan furrowed his brow, slowly opening his eyes. "Hey, Dan, don't sleep. Get up quickly, we can't be late for Professor Lee's class." Dan hesitated for a moment, unable to understand the current situation. Bunk beds, jerseys hanging in the wardrobe, is this a university dormitory? "Dan, what are you staring at? Hurry up and get ready," someone called out. Eric, the guy who just woke Dan up, was frantically changing clothes. "Are you still half asleep?" At that moment, another guy walked in from the balcony. "Stop dawdling, you two. Hurry up and brush your teeth and wash your face." He was another roommate in Dan's college dorm. Dan looked at the 2 of them, his mind momentarily blank. "Dan, did you sleep so much that you've gone stupid?" They pushed Dan to wash up and change clothes, then headed to the classroom. Dan understood. A car accident had brought him back to his senior year in college, 5 years ago. He knew this was a chance given to him by fate. Suddenly, he asked, "Do you guys know which class Betty is in?" Eric replied, "She's in the Chinese department, the department's beauty. She's a sophomore, and many guys are pursuing her." "After class, where are you going?" "Didn't we agree to play basketball after school?" Eric grabbed Dan's arm, looking puzzled. "He went alone." Eric said that Betty had been preparing for the New Year's Eve party performance and should be practicing in the music room. When Dan found Betty in the music room, she was sitting in front of the piano, wearing a white dress. Her delicate fingers danced on the black and white keys, and the evening sun gently caressed her hair as it streamed through the window, casting a warm golden light. She had a gentle smile on her face. It had been a while since he had seen her smile so purely and beautifully. His heart skipped a beat. But Betty wasn't alone in the music room. Girls were nodding their heads and tapping their feet to the melody, watching Betty. Dan stared at Betty for a while. "Betty, your piano playing has improved so much, it almost brought me to tears." Betty blushed and smiled shyly. "Don't exaggerate, don't give me false praise." Dan stood at the doorway the entire time, neither leaving nor entering. He wanted to go in, but he was afraid that it was all an illusion, afraid that the illusion would shatter and the girl who moved, laughed, and played the piano would disappear along with it. Such illusions, he would see them almost every day since her death a year ago, only to lose them every day. All right, the New Year's Eve party is in a few days. If I don't practice the piano properly, I'll embarrass myself in front of the whole school. Betty shook her head. You're overthinking it. It's not like anyone else would embarrass themselves. You're the beauty of our department, not to mention your excellent piano skills. Just by standing on stage, you can capture the attention of the entire audience, especially the guys. Dan suddenly spoke up. Betty. The sudden voice made the music room quiet down. Dan walked up to her, his deep gaze fixed on her. I need to talk to you. Can you come out with me? Anne's eyes lit up. Go ahead, I'll tidy up here for you. Betty was a bit confused. She had almost no interaction with Dan, but she knew who he was. She hesitated for a moment, but Anne had already pushed her out of the door impatiently. Betty glanced at Anne and reluctantly agreed, okay. Quietly, Betty followed behind Dan as they walked outside. Dan took Betty to the lakeside. It was dinner time, and there weren't many people around the lake. The evening glow reflected on the lake's surface, and a gentle breeze blew, causing ripples on the water, as if the evening glow was ebbing and flowing. Betty brushed the strands of hair that were tousled by the breeze behind her ear and asked softly, What do you need from me? Dan looked at her, his deep eyes hiding waves of emotions. Before he could answer, Betty looked up and met his intense gaze. Just as she was about to ask something else, she suddenly felt a tightness around her waist. Before she could react, she found herself falling into a warm yet unfamiliar embrace. Dan held her tightly, not saying a word, just embracing her silently. Betty's heart raced, and she was about to push him away, but then she remembered his eyes, which seemed to hold countless emotions. Her hand froze in midair, her whole body stiffened. What's wrong with you? Just let me hold you for a while, just for a moment. It was her warmth, her breath. He had finally found her. After holding her for a while, he let go of her. Without waiting for her to question, he spoke, Are you hungry? Let's go eat. Betty wanted to ask him what had happened, but she was afraid of accidentally touching upon something that saddened him, so she didn't dare to say anything. Dan took her hand and walked towards the school gate. What do you like to eat this time? Betty didn't go along with him. She gently pulled her hand back, her palm empty. Dan turned to look at her. Dan acted as if nothing had happened and asked again, What do you feel like eating? Well. Betty was about to say that anything was fine, but when she met his gaze, she involuntarily swallowed the words that were about to come out of her mouth. For some reason, she found it difficult to refuse what he said. She pursed her lips and said softly, I feel like having something spicy. There's a Hunan restaurant outside the campus. Shall we go there? Spicy? Yes, can you handle spicy food? Let's go. There were many students coming and going on campus, and occasionally a few pairs of eyes fell on them. Betty occasionally met a few ambiguous gazes, and she felt a discomfort welling up in her heart, instinctively moving a little further away from him. Dan noticed her action and frowned for a moment but didn't say anything. The two of them went to a Hunan restaurant not far from the school. It was dinner time, and the place was crowded. When they arrived, there were no available tables, but luckily, a customer in a small private room had just finished their meal and was settling the bill. As soon as the staff finished cleaning the room, they went in. Dan opened the menu and placed it in front of Betty. What would you like to eat? Betty glanced at him without refusing and picked up the menu to browse. After ordering two of her favorite dishes, she asked Dan, Do you have any preference? Although this is a Hunan restaurant, they also have some non-spicy dishes to cater to the locals' taste. Do you want to take a look? No need. Dan smirked. I like everything. Betty furrowed her brows. Not everything. Dan smiled at her, reaching out to ruffle her hair. "What you ordered is what I want to eat." Betty turned her head slightly, her face blushing, her heart beating a little faster. She randomly pointed to 2 more dishes. When the dishes arrived, Dan looked at the table full of red-colored food and froze. So she liked spicy food this much? He rarely ate with her, often coming back late to avoid having meals together, but even so, she still waited for him every day. Betty looked at him, thinking that the dishes might not suit his taste. "Don't you like these?" "No." Dan picked up a piece of meat and put it into her bowl. "I really like them." Throughout the meal, Dan occasionally served her dishes. Betty secretly observed his expression, but she couldn't see any change as he ate the spicy dishes on the table. Wasn't he supposed to dislike spicy food? Betty was a bit puzzled but didn't say anything. After finishing the meal, it was already dark outside. The 2 of them walked back to the school. The gentle evening breeze brushed past, and Betty closed her eyes, enjoying the coolness of the summer. Dan looked at her delicate and fair face, feeling a quick surge of emotions in his heart. He reached out his hand, wanting to touch her face, but Betty happened to open her eyes, and their gazes met. Betty stepped back silently, her clear eyes fixed on him. "Shall we take a walk to the playground?" he suggested. Betty shook her head. "No, I need to go back. I still have unfinished homework." "Okay." Dan lowered his gaze, softly saying, "I'll walk you back." Betty watched his dimly lit figure under the streetlight and suddenly felt a tinge of melancholy in her heart. Dan walked her back to the dormitory building. Betty glanced at the dormitory building and softly said, "I've arrived." "Thank you for treating me to dinner." "You don't have to thank me." "Never," Dan said calmly. Betty paused for a moment, pursing her lips. "Then I'll go back first." Just as she turned around, Dan's deep and serious voice suddenly sounded, "Do you still love me?" Betty was taken aback by his words. She liked him, but she had never told anyone about it before. She turned to look at him but then thought of something and said, "If you have a fight with your girlfriend, communicate well with her. Hugging other girls and having meals with them will only make the conflicts between the 2 of you worse." After saying this, Betty walked into the girls' dormitory building without looking back. Dan was stunned for a moment before he reacted to her words. Oh no, he had forgotten about this. At this time, he was supposed to be unfamiliar with Betty and in a relationship with Kathy. Dan rubbed his forehead and closed his eyes, a hint of anxiety flashing in his eyes. There were some things he couldn't wait for. Marriage to divorce, like a complete tragedy. What's even scarier is that I often have this illusion, feeling like it was a real life I once experienced. Dan was shaken to the core. He suddenly felt lost and could only hold her in his arms, explaining in a hoarse voice, "I'm sorry, it's my fault." Dan's eyes showed an unprecedented pain. "I shouldn't have made you sad." Betty forcefully broke free from his embrace, took a few steps back, and looked at him. "Let's leave the past behind. I don't want to look back, nor do I want to delve into the origin of this dream. I just want to live a good life in the future." Dan swallowed hard, his voice hoarse. "I can be there with you." "No need," Betty softly refused. "I will live my own life well, but you can't be a part of it." Dan gazed at her with deep sorrow, unable to speak. "That's it then." Betty lowered her gaze, suppressing all her emotion. "Let's pretend we've never met." After saying that, Betty took a few more steps back and turned to leave. "I can't do it," Dan's voice of sorrow suddenly rang out, shaking Betty's heart. "Betty, I can't do it." He walked towards her step by step, stopping behind her. "Give me another chance, please," he pleaded, almost desperately. Betty still didn't turn around to look at him, only closing her teary eyes. "I'm sorry. If you really like me, stay away from me." There would never be an ending between them, she would never repeat the same mistakes in this lifetime. Dan's heart trembled fiercely as he watched her resolute figure walking away, his eyes filled with endless sadness. "Betty," letting go, he truly couldn't do it. But he never expected that she would have memories from a past life. She had suffered in a lifetime, and he couldn't bear to let her go through that pain again with those memories, even in this lifetime. He was willing to love her with his life. Today, they talked about everything, and Betty returned to her normal life, but in her life, there was no longer any intrusion from Dan. Anne was puzzled. Where is Smith, the school heartthrob? Why does it feel like he's been missing lately? Betty shrugged. I don't know. Dan was the person she loved most in her dreams, but in this reality, he was just a passerby in her life. And there are many beautiful things waiting for us to explore in life. Don't waste your time searching for someone. Anne pouted and then hugged Betty's shoulder. All right, Missy, our future is still bright. The two girls laughed cheerfully, striding forward fearlessly. Dan stood under a tree, wearing a mask, watching them from afar, his gaze softening as he looked at Betty. Betty, be bold and move forward. In this lifetime, I will silently protect you until eternity, until old age. Renove el apartamento de mi madre, pero ella exigió que pagara 3 veces más, así que encontré otro lugar y mi hermano mamado y su esposa se mudaron en su lugar. Luego, un mes después, mamá llamó y preguntó por qué no había pagado el alquiler. Part 1 Siempre he sido la práctica en mi familia. Mientras que mi hermano mayor, Bart, estaba ocupado persiguiendo su sueño de convertirse en un empresario exitoso, me enfoque en escalar la escalera corporativa paso a paso. Ese enfoque finalmente dio sus frutos cuando conseguí un puesto en crowd for associates, con un salario que hacía que mi trabajo anterior pareciera cambio de bolsillo. La única desventaja, el trayecto me estaba matando. 2 horas de ida y vuelta significaban que pasaba 4 horas al día solo para ir y volver del trabajo. Después de 2 semanas de esta pesadilla, supe que tenía que encontrar un lugar más cerca de la oficina. Ese sábado, fui a la casa de mis padres para nuestra cena familiar tradicional. Mamá estaba en la cocina revolviendo algo que olía increíble, mientras que papá estaba sentado en su sillón favorito leyendo el periódico. Se sentía como cualquier otra cena de sábado que habíamos tenido desde que era niña. ¿Cómo vi el nuevo trabajo, cariño? Preguntó mamá mientras colocaba una cazuela humante en la mesa. Realmente bien, respondí, ayudándola a poner la mesa. El único problema es el trayecto. Estoy buscando un lugar nuevo para alquilar más cerca del trabajo. Fue entonces cuando noté que mis padres intercambiaban una de esas miradas que habían perfeccionado en sus 30 años de matrimonio. Mamá se limpió las manos en el delantal y se sentó. Sabes, Amber, yo, podríamos tener una solución para ti. ¿Recuerdas el viejo apartamento de la abuela Helen? Ese que herid. Nuestros inquilinos se mudaron la semana pasada y está a 5 minutos a pie de tu nueva oficina. Casi dejé caer el tender que sostenía. Por supuesto, recordaba ese apartamento. Había pasado incontables fines de semana allí cuando la abuela Helen aún vivía. Era un acogedor apartamento de 2 habitaciones en un vecindario tranquilo, con ventanas enormes y un pequeño balcón donde la abuela solía cultivar sus queridas petunias. ¿Cuánto sería el alquiler? Pregunt, tratando de no sonar demasiado entusiasmada. Mamá mencionó una cifra que hizo que mis ojos se abrieran. Era aproximadamente una vez y media menos que el precio promedio de mercado en esa área. Por supuesto, te daríamos un descuento familiar, agregó con una sonrisa. Lo tomaré. Dije de inmediato. Ni siquiera intent negociar. La ubicación era perfecta y el precio, inmeasurable. Entonces está decidido, dijo finalmente papá, levantando la vista de su periódico. Ahora, ¿has oído sobre el último éxito de tu hermano? Acaba de conseguir 3 nuevos clientes corporativos para su empresa de mensajería. Realmente está triunfando en el negocio de las entregas. YSC, la conversation cambio a su tema favorito, los logros de Bart. Mi sente ali, empujando la comida en mi plato, asinciendo en los momentos apropiados mientras mis padres se deshacian en elogios sobre como su hijo se estaba convirtiendo en un emprendedor exitoso. Siempre era así. Bart era el niño de oro, el que asumía riesgos, el que se atrevía a sonar en grande. Yo era solo, bueno, solo Amber. El día de la mudanza fue sorprendentemente rápido. La verdadera sorpresa llegó cuando entré en el apartamento de la abuela Helen con la primera caja en mis manos. El lugar estaba, bueno, digamos que los inquilinos interiores no lo habían tratado exactamente como si fuera suyo. Las paredes estaban cubiertas de papel tapiz anticuado que se estaba despegando en las esquinas, había manchas misteriosas en el techo y el único mueble era un viejo sofá que parecía haber sobrevivido a varias guerras mundiales. La mamá esa noche, sentada con las piernas cruzadas en ese viejo sofá, el único lugar para sentarse en todo el apartamento. Hoy, mamá, estaría bien si hiciera algunas renovaciones? Sonaba distraída, probablemente viendo uno de sus programas de cocina. Oh, claro, cariño, solo no lo hagas demasiado brillante, ya sabes cómo me siento acerca de esos colores neón de moda que todos están usando hoy en día. Tuve que reírme de eso. Mamá, alguna vez me has visto usar algo más brillante que azul marino? Confía en mí, estoy pensando más en tonos tierra y neutros. Esa noche, me sumergí profundamente en Internet, navegando por sitios web de diseño de interiores y tableros de Pinterest. Creé un tablero de ideas con mi vision, gris cálidos, beige suave y algún que otro acento azul profundo. Todo sería discreto pero elegante, cómodo pero bien pensado, justo como yo. Supongo que los siguientes meses se convertirán en un buen de trabajo y renovaciones. Llegaba a casa de la oficina, me cambiaba de ropa y me ponía a trabajar. Primero fue quitar el papel tapiz, luego vino la pintura. Las compras de muebles se convirtieron en mi nuevo pasatiempo de fin de semana. Pasaba horas en las tiendas probando sofás, midiendo espacios y comparando precios. Poco a poco, fui construyendo mi hogar, un cómodo sofá gris perfecto para noches de películas, una sólida mesa de comedor de madera que podía sentar a 6 personas, una alfombra molida que unía todo. La transformación tomó 6 meses de fines de semana y noches, pero finalmente, estaba hecho. Mirando mi apartamento terminado, sentí una oleada de orgullo tan fuerte que casi me hizo llorar. Yo había hecho esto. Cuando mamá vino a ver el resultado final, estaba nerviosa. Camino por cada habitación lentamente, pasando la mano por las nuevas encimeras de la cocina, examinando las cuidadosamente elegidas lámparas, estudiando el sutil patrón del papel tapiz en el dormitorio. Amber, dijo finalmente, llorando hacia mí, esto es impresionante. Casi me caigo. Mamá no solía dar completos libremente, especialmente cuando se trataba de mí, pero ahí estaba, sonriendo de verdad, impresionada. ¿De verdad haces todo esto tú sola? Preguntó, señalando el salón. Asentí, tratando de no parecer demasiado complacida conmigo misma. Bueno, los tutorials de YouTube ayudaron mucho. Y es hermoso, dijo, y luego hizo algo que no había hecho en años, mi abrazo. Un abrazo real, no uno de esos repetidos y obligatorios que normalmente me daba en las reuniones familiares. 2 semanas después, me dirigí a otra cena familiar, prácticamente saltando de emoción. Había conseguido un ascenso en el trabajo, gerente de cuentas senior, con un buen aumento de sueldo y mi propio equipo a cargo. No podía esperar para compartir las noticias. Mamá, papá, dije durante una pausa en la conversación, tengo buenas noticias. Me ascendieron en el trabajo. Mamá apenas levantó la vista de su plato. Qué bien, querida, ese gyro hacia papá, beyond la voz. ¿Has oído de Bart hoy? Ahí fue cuando empezó la verdadera conversación de la cena. Resultó que la empresa de mensajería de mi hermano estaba en problemas. Un competidor más grande había llegado a la ciudad, una cadena nacional con aplicaciones de seguimiento elegantes y precios más bajos. Los clientes de Bart estaban abandonando el barco más rápido que ratas en un barco que ese hund. Vamos a ayudarlo, anunció Papa, empujando su plato. Hemos decidido pedir un préstamo. Casi me ahogo con mi agua. ¿Un préstamo? Miren, tal vez esto sea realmente una oportunidad. Si no puedo competir con esta empresa más grande, tal vez sea hora de intentar algo diferente, de empezar de nuevo. Podría ser mejor que seguir desperdiciando dinero. El silencio que siguió fue ensordecedor. Mama y Papa intercambiaron una de sus miradas, no las cariñosas que solían compartir, sino las que dicen que estaban decepcionados de mí otra vez. No entiendes de negocios, Amber, dijo finalmente Papa con voz severa. Siempre has jugado a lo seguro con tus trabajos de oficina. Tu hermano es un emprendedor, él toma riesgos. La familia siempre ayuda a la familia, agregó Mama firmemente. Eso es lo que hacemos. Abrí la boca para discutir, luego la cerré de nuevo. ¿De qué servía? Ya habían tomado su decisión. Podría haberles dicho que había descubierto la cura para el cáncer y aún así estarían más preocupados por las furgonitas de entrega de Bart. Los siguientes 6 meses fueron como ver un choque de autos en cámara lenta. Mama llamaba ocasionalmente para actualizarme sobre la situación, aunque yo nunca preguntaba. El préstamo que tomaron compró a Bart algunas furgonitas nuevas y lo ayudó a bajar sus precios, pero no fue suficiente. El competidor siguió expandiéndose, siguió tomando clientes, siguió promocionando su elegante aplicación y sus promesas de entrega al día siguiente. Entonces llegó la llamada que había estado esperando todo este tiempo, pero no de la manera que imaginaba. El nombre de Laura parpadeaba en la pantalla de mi teléfono y por un momento dudé en contestar. Era casi medianoche y mi mejor amiga desde la universidad nunca llamaba tan tarde, a menos que fuera una emergencia. Laura, contesté, sintiendo una inexplicable opresión en el pecho. Amber, su voz sonaba quebrada, casi irreconocible. Necesito verte, es urgente. Por favor. Había algo en su tono que me heló la sangre. Laura siempre había sido la fuerte, la inquebrantable, la que mantenía la compostura incluso en las peores situaciones. Escucharla así, tan vulnerable, tan destruida, me hizo saber que algo verdaderamente terrible había sucedido. ¿Dónde estás? Pregunté, ya buscando mis leaves. En el café Violeta, respondió entre sollozos. Por favor, ven sola. El café Violeta era en nuestro lugar, un pequeño establecimiento a 2 cuadras de mi apartamento donde habíamos compartido risas, lágrimas y secretos durante años. El lugar donde celebramos cuando conseguí mi trabajo en Crawford Associates, donde él logró cuando terminó su última relación, donde planeamos nuestros futuros mientras soñábamos con cambiar el mundo. Cuando llegué, el café estaba casi vacío, solo quedaban un par de estudiantes en una esquina, absortos en sus laptops, y Laura sentada en nuestra mesa habitual junto a la ventana. Lavaba gafas de sol a pesar de que era de noche y el local estaba tenuamente iluminado. Su cabello, normalmente perfectamente arreglado, estaba despeinado, como si hubiera pasado horas pasando sus manos por él con desesperación. Laura, me senté frente a ella, intentando no mostrar la alarma que sentía por su aspecto. ¿Qué sucede? Con manos temblorosas, se quitó las gafas de sol, revelando ojos hinchados y enrojecidos por el llanto. Tenía el rímel corrido y marcas de lágrimas en las mejillas. Esta no era la Laura que conocía, la exitosa consultora de marketing digital que siempre parecía tener todo bajo control. Hay algo que necesitas saber, comenzó, su voz apenas un susurro. Es sobre Bart. Mi corazón dio un vuelco. ¿Qué había hecho mi hermano ahora? Más deudas? Más decisiones empresariales desastrosas? ¿Qué nuevo desastre tendría que arreglar mi familia esta vez? Bart y yo, se detuvo, respirando profundamente antes de continuar, hemos estado viéndonos durante los últimos 6 meses. El mundo pareció detenerse. Las palabras flotaban en el aire entre nosotros, pesadas, tóxicas, imposibles de ignorar. Mi mejor amigo y mi hermano. Mi hermano casado. El niño dorado de la familia, el esposo de María. Al principio fue solo para hablar de negocios, continuó Laura, sus llegando nerviosamente con la servileta, reduciéndola a pequeños pedazos. Me pidió consejos sobre marketing digital para su empresa, dijo que necesitaba modernizarse, competir con las grandes cadenas. Nos reuníamos en cafeterias, oficinas, todo muy profesional. Se detuvo, tomando un sorbo de su café frío antes de continuar. Pero luego las reuniones se volvieron más largas, empezamos a hablar de otras cosas. Me hacía sentir especial, valorada. Decía que nadie entendía su visión como yo, que era la única que realmente creía en él. Los países empezaban a encajar. Las llamadas tarde en la noche que Bart recibió y se alejaba para contestar, las reuniones de negocios que se extendían durante horas, las nuevas estrategias de marketing que presumía haber desarrollado por sí mismo. Todo había sido una elaborada red de mentiras. ¿Por qué me lo dices ahora? Pregunt, mi voz más fría de lo que pretendía. ¿Por qué después de 6 meses? Laura levantó la vista, sus ojos llenos de lágrimas nuevamente. Porque María está embarazada, respondió, las palabras saliendo como si lo quemaran la garganta. 3 meses. Why Bart? Bart me dijo que lo nuestro fue un error, que debí concentrarse en su familia, en su futuro hijo. Me dijo que lo entienda, que sea profesional al respecto. La ironía era casi dolorosa. María, la dulce y paciente María, la mujer que había estado al lado de Bart durante años, apoyándolo en cada fracaso empresarial, aguantando sus largas horas de trabajo, sus promesas vacías, sus sueños grandiosos que nunca se materializaban. ¿Y ahora esto? ¿Mama y papa lo saben? Pregunt, aunque imaginaba la respuesta. Lo saben, confirmó Laura, su voz apenas audible. Bart les contó sobre nosotros hace un mes, cuando se enteró del embarazo. Me llamaron a su casa, me dijeron que me mantuviera alejada, que pensara en la familia, en el bebé que viene en camino. Tu madre me dijo que era lo mejor para todos, que algunas cosas deben cuidarse en silencio por el bien mayor. Por supuesto que lo sabían. Por supuesto que eligieron proteger a Bart, mantener las apariencias, sacrificar a otra mujer en el altar de la reputación de su hijo dorado. Era el patrón que habían seguido toda su vida. Bart cometió un error, la familia lo encubrir, alguien más paga las consecuencias. Me levanté abruptamente, me silla chirriando contra el suelo. Los estudiantes en la esquina levantaron la vista por un momento antes de volver a sus pantallas. No me importó. Laura, dije, mi voz temblando de rabia contenida, necesito que me cuentes todo. Cada detalle, cada mentira, cada excusa que te dio. Y luego vamos a hacer algo al respecto. ¿Hacer algo? Preguntó, confundida. ¿Qué podemos hacer? Ya está hecho, Amber. María está embarazada, Bart ha elegido. Mis padres han permitido que esto suceda durante demasiado tiempo, la interrumpí. Han creado un monstruo, Laura. Un hombre que cree que pueda hacer lo que quiera sin consecuencias, que pueda jugar con la vida de las personas como si fueran países en su pequeño juego de empresario exitoso. Laura comenzó a buscar en su teléfono, sus manos todavía temblando. Tengo mensajes, dijo, fotos, correos, todo. Al principio los guardaba, porque pensé que significaban algo, que éramos especiales. Mientras me mostraba la evidencia de la traición de mi hermano, una extraña calma se apoderó de mí. Por primera vez en mi vida, fixé mi familia con total claridad. La devoción ciega de mis padres por Bart no solo lo había arruinado él, sino que había dejado un rastro de destrucción en las vidas de todos los que lo rodeaban. Los mensajes eran un catálogo de manipulación, promesas de amor eterno mezcladas con excusas empresariales, declaraciones apasionadas seguidas de pedidos de consejos profesionales. Bart había jugado perfectamente su papel, mezclando lo personal con lo profesional hasta que las líneas se volvieron borrosas. ¿Sabes qué es lo peor? Solozó Laura, guardando su teléfono. María y yo éramos amigas. No cercanas, pero compartimos café a veces cuando iba a las oficinas de Bart. Me contaba sobre sus sueños de ser madre, sobre cómo apoyaba a Bart en todo. ¿Cómo pude hacerlo esto? La mayor fijamente, recordando todas las veces que había visto a María en las cenas familiares, su sonrisa valiente mientras escuchaba a mis padres alabar a Bart, sus ojos cansados mientras él presumía de otro gran negocio que inevitablemente fracasaría. María, quien había sacrificado su propia carrera para apoyar los sueños de mi hermano, quien había aguantado cada fracaso con dignidad y amor. Vamos a arreglar esto, dije finalmente, tomando las manos de Laura entre las mías. No por Bart, no por mis padres, sino por nosotros, por María. Porque ya es hora de que las mujeres en la vida de mi hermano dejen de pagar por sus errores. ¿Cómo? Preguntó Laura, un destello de esperanza atravesando su rostro destruido por el llanto. Primero, María necesita saber la verdad. No de Bart, no de mis padres, sino de nosotros. Marías conocer al hombre con quien está construyendo su vida, quien está criando a su hijo. Y luego vamos a asegurarnos de que Bart finalmente enfrenta las consecuencias de sus acciones. Esa noche, mientras conducía de regreso a casa, mi teléfono sonó. Era mamá. Amber, cariño, ¿vienes a cenar el sábado? Bart tiene grandes noticias que compartir. Grandes noticias, por supuesto. El bebé. El heredero del imperio en ruinas de Bart. El pequeño milagro que supuestamente arreglaría todo, que haría que todos olvidáramos las mentiras, las traiciones, el dolor. Sí, mamá, respondí, una sonrisa amarga en mis labios, no me lo perdería por nada del mundo. Mientras colgaba, mi mente estaba trabajando en un plan. Era hora de que alguien en esta familia se enfrentara a la verdad, sin importar cuán dolorosa fuera. Y mis padres no estaban dispuestos a hacerlo, entonces tendría que ser yo. El apartamento de la abuela Helen, que tanto había trabajado en renovar, de repente se sentía como un santuario, un lugar donde podía pensar con claridad, lejos de las manipulaciones y las mentiras de mi familia. Mientras me sentaba en mi sofá gris, rodeada de los colores neutros y tranquilos que había elegido con tanto cuidado, tomé una decisión. Esta vez, la historia tendría un final diferente. Esta vez, las mujeres no seríamos simples espectadoras en el drama de Bart. Esta vez, tomaríamos el control de nuestra propia narrativa. Entonces llegó la llamada que había estado esperando todo este tiempo, pero no de la manera que imaginaba. El nombre de Laura parpadeaba en la pantalla de mi teléfono y por un momento dudé en contestar. Era casi medianoche y mi mejor amiga desde la universidad nunca llamaba tan tarde, a menos que fuera una emergencia. Laura, contesté, sintiendo una inexplicable opresión en el pecho. Amber, su voz sonaba quebrada, casi irreconocible. Necesito verte, es urgent. Por favor. Había algo en su tono que me heló la sangre. Laura siempre había sido la fuerte, la inquebrantable, la que mantenía la compostura incluso en las peores situaciones. Escucharla así, tan vulnerable, tan destruida, me hizo saber que algo verdaderamente terrible había sucedido. ¿Dónde estás? Pregunté, ya buscando mis labios. En el café Violeta, respondió entre solozos. Por favor, ven sola. El café Violeta era nuestro lugar, un pequeño establecimiento a 2 cuadras de mi apartamento donde habíamos compartido risas, lágrimas y secretos durante años. El lugar donde celebramos cuando conseguí mi trabajo en Crawford Associates, donde el loro cuando terminó su última relación, donde planeamos nuestros futuros mientras soñábamos con cambiar el mundo. Cuando llegué, el café estaba casi vacío, solo quedaban un par de estudiantes en una esquina, absortos en sus laptops, y Laura sentada en nuestra mesa habitual junto a la ventana. Lavaba gafas de sol a pesar de que era de noche y el local estaba tenuamente iluminado. Su cabello, normalmente perfectamente arreglado, estaba despeinado, como si hubiera pasado horas pasando sus manos por él con desesperación. Laura, me senté frente a ella, intentando no mostrar la alarma que sentía por su aspecto. ¿Qué sucede? Con manos temblorosas, quitó las gafas de sol, revelando ojos hinchados y enrojecidos por el llanto. Tenía el rímel corrido y marcas de lágrimas en las mejillas. Esta no era la Laura que conocía, la exitosa consultora de marketing digital que siempre parecía tener todo bajo control. Hay algo que necesitas saber, comenzó, su voz apenas un susurro. Es sobre Bart. Mi corazón. Dio un vuelco. ¿Qué había hecho mi hermano ahora? ¿Más deudas? ¿Más decisiones empresariales desastrosas? ¿Qué nuevo desastre tendría que arreglar mi familia esta vez? Bart y yo, se detuvo, respirando profundamente antes de continuar, hemos estado viéndonos durante los últimos 6 meses. El mundo pareció detenerse. Las palabras flotaban en el aire entre nosotros, pesadas, tóxicas, imposibles de ignorar. Mi mejor amigo y mi hermano. Mi hermano casado. El niño dorado de la familia, el esposo de María. Al principio fue solo para hablar de negocios, continuó Laura, sus dedos llegando nerviosamente con la servileta, reduciéndola a pequeños pedazos. Me pidió consejos sobre marketing digital para su empresa, dijo que necesitaba modernizarse, competir con las grandes cadenas. Nos reuníamos en cafeterias, oficinas, todo muy profesional. Se detuvo, tomando un sorbo de su café frío antes de continuar. Pero luego las reuniones se volvieron más largas, empezamos a hablar de otras cosas. Me hacía sentir especial, valorada. Decía que nadie entendía su visión como yo, que era la única que realmente creía en él. Los países empezaban a encajar. Las llamadas tarde en la noche que Bart recibió y se alejaba para contestar, las reuniones de negocios que se extendían durante horas, las nuevas estrategias de marketing que presumía haber desarrollado por sí mismo. Todo había sido una elaborada red de mentiras. ¿Por qué me lo dices ahora? Pregunt, mi voz más fría de lo que pretendía. ¿Por qué después de 6 meses? Laura levantó la vista, sus ojos llenos de lágrimas nuevamente. Porque María está embarazada, respondió, las palabras saliendo como si le quemaran la garganta. 3 meses. Why Bart? Bart me dijo que lo nuestro fue un error, que debí concentrarse en su familia, en su futuro hijo. Me dijo que lo entienda, que sea profesional al respecto. La ironía era casi dolorosa. María, la dulce y paciente María, la mujer que había estado al lado de Bart durante años, apoyándolo en cada fracaso empresarial, aguantando sus largas horas de trabajo, sus promesas vacías, sus sueños grandiosos que nunca se materializaban. ¿Y ahora esto? ¿Mama y papa lo saben? Pregunt, aunque imaginaba la respuesta. Lo saben, confirmó Laura, su voz apenas audible. Bart les contó sobre nosotros hace un mes, cuando se enteró del embarazo. Me llamaron a su casa, me dijeron que me mantuviera elgada, que pensara en la familia, en el bebé que viene en camino. Tu madre me dijo que era lo mejor para todos, que algunas cosas deben cuidarse en silencio por el bien mayor. Por supuesto que lo sabían. Por supuesto que eligieron proteger a Bart, mantener las apariencias, sacrificar a otra mujer en el altar de la reputación de su hijo dorado. Era el patrón que habían seguido toda su vida. Bart cometió un error, la familia lo encubrir, alguien más paga las consecuencias. Me levanto abruptamente, me silla chirriando contra el suelo. Los estudiantes en la esquina levantaron la vista por un momento antes de volver a sus pantallas. No me importó. Laura, dije, mi voz temblando de rabia contenida, necesito que me cuentes todo. Cada detalle, cada mentira, cada excusa que te dio. Y luego vamos a hacer algo al respecto. ¿Hacer algo? Preguntó, confundida. ¿Qué podemos hacer? Ya está hecho, Amber. María está embarazada, Bart ha elegido. Mis padres han permitido que esto suceda durante demasiado tiempo, la interrumpí. Han creado un monstruo, Laura. Un hombre que cree que pueda hacer lo que quiera sin consecuencias, que pueda jugar con la vida de las personas como si fueran países en su pequeño juego de empresario exitoso. Laura comenzó a buscar en su teléfono, sus manos todavía temblando. Tengo mensajes, dijo, fotos, correos, todo. Al principio los guardaba, porque pensé que significaban algo, que éramos especiales. Mientras me mostraba la evidencia de la traición de mi hermano, una extraña calma se apoderó de mí. Por primera vez en mi vida, fixé mi familia con total claridad. La devoción ciega de mis padres por Bart no solo lo había arruinado a él, sino que había dejado un rastro de destrucción en las vidas de todos los que lo rodeaban. Los mensajes eran un catálogo de manipulación, promesas de amor eterno mezcladas con excusas empresariales, declaraciones apasionadas seguidas de pedidos de consejos profesionales. Bart había jugado perfectamente su papel, mezclando lo personal con lo profesional hasta que las líneas se volvieron borrosas. ¿Sabes qué es lo peor? Solozó Laura, guardando su teléfono. María y yo éramos amigas. No cercanas, pero compartimos café a veces cuando iba a las oficinas de Bart. Me contaba sobre sus sueños de ser madre, sobre cómo apoyaba a Bart en todo. ¿Cómo pude hacerlo esto? La mayor fijamente, recordando todas las veces que había visto a María en las cenas familiares, su sonrisa valiente mientras escuchaba a mis padres alabar a Bart, sus ojos cansados mientras él presumía de otro gran negocio que inevitablemente fracasaría. María, quien había sacrificado su propia carrera para apoyar los sueños de mi hermano, quien había aguantado cada fracaso con dignidad y amor. Vamos a arreglar esto, dije finalmente, tomando las manos de Laura entre las mías. No por Bart, no por mis padres, sino por nosotros, por María. Porque ya es hora de que las mujeres en la vida de mi hermano dejen de pagar por sus errores. ¿Cómo? Preguntó Laura, un destello de esperanza atravesando su rostro destruido por el llanto. Primero, María necesita saber la verdad. No de Bart, no de mis padres, sino de nosotros. Maurice conocer al hombre con quien está criando a su hijo. Y luego vamos a asegurarnos de que Bart finalmente enfrenta las consecuencias de sus acciones. Y esa noche, mientras conducía de regreso a casa, mi teléfono sonó. Era mamá. Amber, cariño, ¿vienes a cenar el sábado? Bart tiene grandes noticias que compartir. Grandes noticias, por supuesto. El bebé. El heredero del imperio en ruinas de Bart. El pequeño milagro que supuestamente arreglaría todo, que haría que todos olvidáramos las mentiras, las traiciones, el dolor. Sí, mamá, respondí, una sonrisa amarga en mis labios, no me lo perdería por nada del mundo. Mientras colgaba, mi mente estaba trabajando en un plan. Era hora de que alguien en esta familia se enfrentara a la verdad, sin importar cuán doloroso fuera. Si mis padres no estaban dispuestos a hacerlo, entonces tendría que ser yo. El apartamento de la abuela Helen, que tanto había trabajado en renovar, de repente se sentía como un santuario, un lugar donde podía pensar con claridad, lejos de las manipulaciones y las mentiras de mi familia. Mientras me sentaba en mi sofá gris, rodeada de los colores neutros y tranquilos que había elegido con tanto cuidado, tomé una decisión. Esta vez, la historia tendría un final diferente. Esta vez, las mujeres no seríamos simples espectadoras en el drama de Bart. Esta vez, tomaremos el control de nuestra propia narrativa. El tambor sonó a las 3 de la mañana. Me desperté sobresaltada, el corazón latiendo con fuerza en mi pecho. Por un momento, me quedé inmóvil en la oscuridad, preguntándome si lo había sonado. Entonces sonó de nuevo, más insistente esta vez. Me levanté de la cama, envolviendo mi cuerpo en una bata. A través de la marilla de la puerta, Sixa María, su rostro pálido iluminado por la luz del pasillo. Tenía los ojos hinchados y rojos, y lavaba la misma ropa de la cena. No sabía a dónde más ir, susurró cuando abrí la puerta. La hice pasar inmediatamente, guiándola hacia el sofá gris que tanto me había costado elegir. Parecía tan pequeña allí sentada, tan vulnerable, con sus brazos protectores alrededor de su vientre. ¿Has estado conduciendo toda la noche? Preguntó suavemente mientras preparaba té en la cocina. No. Sí, no lo sé, respondió, su voz quebrada. Condujo hasta el mirador de la ciudad. Me quedé allí, mirando las luces. Pensando en todo, en nada. Luego condujo por la ciudad, pasé por lugares donde Bart y yo solíamos ser felices, o donde creía que éramos felices. Luego entré una taza de té de manzanilla, sentándome a su lado. Por un largo momento, ninguna de las dos habló. El silencio estaba lleno de palabras no dichas, de dolor compartido. ¿Desde cuándo lo sabías? Preguntó finalmente, sus ojos fijos en la taza humeante. Laura me lo contó hace unos días, respondí honestamente. No podía seguir con la mentira, no después de enterarme de tu embarazo. María asintió lentamente. Laura, susurró el nombre, como es lo delira. Mi amiga Laura, la misma Laura que me ayudó a elegir la cuna para el bebé la semana pasada. Sus manos comenzaron a temblar tanto que tuve que tomar la taza antes de que la derramara. Las lágrimas comenzaron a caer silenciosamente por sus mejillas. ¿Sabes qué es lo peor? Continuó, su voz apenas audible. No es el engaño, no es la traición. Es darme cuenta de que toda mi vida ha sido una mentira. Cada decisión que tomé, cada sueño que abandoné, cada vez que me convencí de que valía la pena, porque era por él, por nosotros. Se quebró entonces, los solozos sacudiendo su cuerpo. La abrace, sosteniéndola mientras anos de dolor reprimido salían a la superficie. Dejé mi trabajo, solozo contra mi hombro. Abandoné mi maestría. Me convertí en lo que él quería que fuera, en lo que tus padres esperaban que fuera, la esposa perfecta, la futura madre perfecta, siempre comprensiva, siempre apoyando sus sueños mientras enterraba los míos. No es demasiado tarde, dije suavemente, acariciando su cabello. Nada está perdido, María. Eres más fuerte de lo que crees. Se apartó ligeramente, mirando con ojos brillantes de lágrimas. ¿Cómo? Estoy embarazada, sin trabajo, sin título. Pero no estás sola, la interrumpí firmemente. Me tienes a mí. Y cream es hora de que las mujeres en la vida de Bart dejemos de sacrificarnos por él. En ese momento, mi teléfono vibró sobre la mesa. Era Laura. Ponlo en altavoz, pidió María. Limpiando las lágrimas con el dorso de la mano. Dudé por un momento, pero la determinación en sus ojos me convenció. Laura, respondí, colocando el teléfono entre nosotros. Amber, María está contigo? La voz de Laura sonaba temblorosa, asustada. Estoy aquí, respondió María, su voz sorprendentemente firme. El silencio que siguió fue denso, cargado de emociones no expresadas. Lo siento, susurró finalmente Laura, su voz quebrantos. Lo siento tanto, María. Sé que no tengo derecho a pedir perdón, que lo que hice es imperdonable. Lo amabas, la interrumpió María. Otro silencio, más largo esta vez. Creo que sí, respondió Laura finalmente. O tal vez solo amaba la idea de él, el hombre que pretendía ser, no el que realmente es. María soltó una risa amarga. Bienvenida al club. María, comenzó Laura, pero María la interrumpió nuevamente. No, escúchame. Durante años he vivido enamorada de una ilusión, del hombre que Bart pretendía ser, del esposo que sus padres juraban que era, del futuro padre que yo esperaba que fuera. Pero esa persona no existe, nunca existió. Sus palabras resonaron en la habitación, pesadas de verdad y dolor. Los dos nos engañaron, a ti con promesas de amor, a mí con votos matrimoniales. La diferencia es que tú pudiste alejarte, yo estoy atada a él para siempre, a través de este bebé. No tiene por qué ser así, intervine suavemente. Un bebé no es una cadena, María. Es una oportunidad para ser mejor, para hacer las cosas diferentes. Amber tiene razón, la voz de Laura sonaba más fuerte ahora. Si me permites, si nos permites, queremos ayudar. No por Bart, no por la culpa, sino porque es lo correcto. María se quedó en silencio por un largo momento, sus manos descansando sobre su vientre. ¿Saben qué es lo más irónico? Dijo finalmente. Siempre quise una hermana, y ahora, de la manera más retorcida posible, tengo dos. Los tres remos entonces, un sonido mezclado con lágrimas, pero genuino. Era el sonido de algo rompiéndose y algo nuevo comenzando a formarse. Necesito un plan, dijo María después de un momento. No puedo seguir viviendo así, pretendiendo que todo está bien, siendo la esposa trofeo de Bart mientras él destruye todo lo que toca. Entonces hagamos un plan, respondí, levantando para buscar papel y lápiz. Entre los tres, Laura llegó a mi apartamento una hora después, con otras profundas y el maquillaje corrido, pero con una determinación en sus ojos que no lo había visto antes. Los tres nos sentamos alrededor de mi mesa de comedor, tazas de café fuerte frente a nosotros, te para María, y comenzamos a planear. No era una reunión de venganza, aunque el dolor y la traición estaban presentes en cada palabra. Era una reunión de supervivencia, de renacimiento. Primero, dije, sacando mi laptop. María necesita un lugar propio. Puedo quedarme aquí, comenzó María, pero negó con la cabeza. Necesitas tu espacio, tu propio territorio. Y resulta que conozco el lugar perfecto. Les mostrar el listado de un pequeño apartamento en mi edificio, 2 pisos más arriba que el mío. Era más pequeño que el que compartía con Bart, pero tenía una habitación extra, perfecta para el bebé, y una vista preciosa de la ciudad. No puedo permitirme, comenzó María, pero Laura la interrumpió. Yo puedo ayudar, dijo firmemente. Es lo mínimo que puedo hacer. No, respondió María con igual firmeza. Aprecio la oferta, Laura, pero necesito hacer esto por mí misma. Necesito demostrarme que puedo. Entonces hagámoslo de otra manera, sugerí. María, eres una de las mejores administradoras que conozco. Laura necesita ayuda con su consultor de marketing, y yo tengo contactos en Crawford Associates que siempre están buscando asesoría externa. Los ojos de María se iluminaron por primera vez en horas. ¿Están sugiriendo una sociedad? Completo Laura. Igualitaria, profesional, sin culpa, sin deudas emocionales, solo 3 mujeres haciendo lo mejor que saben hacer. pero el bebé? María puso una mano sobre su vientre. El bebé tendrá tres mujeres fuertes cuidando de él o ella, respondí. Why, más importante aún, tendrá una madre que lo enseñará que nunca debe conformarse con menos de lo que merece. María se quedó en silencio por un largo momento, sus ojos moviéndose entre nosotros y los papeles sobre la mesa. ¿Saben qué es lo más gracioso? Dijo finalmente. Durante años, Bart me convenció de que no era lo suficientemente buena, de que necesitaba su aprobación, su dirección. Y aquí estoy, planeando mi futuro con las dos mujeres que, según él, deberían ser mis enemigas. Los hombres como Bart prosperan dividiendo a las mujeres, respondió Laura. Y es hora de que aprendamos a unirnos. Trabajamos hasta el amanecer, desarrollando planes, estrategias, dividiendo responsabilidades. María se mudaría al nuevo apartamento esa misma semana, Laura utilizaría sus contactos para conseguir nuestros primeros clientes, yo me encargaría de la parte legal y financiera. Cuando los primeros rayos del sol comenzaron a filtrarse por las ventanas, teníamos más que un plan, teníamos un futuro. Hay algo más que necesitamos discutir, dijo María, su voz más fuerte ahora. Bart no se quedará quieto cuando se entere de esto, y mis padres, tendrán que aceptar que su hijo perfecto no es tan perfecto. Y si no pueden hacerlo, entonces tendrán que aceptar que ya no soy la hija que se queda calada para mantener la paz, respondí. Nos tenemos las unas a las otras, agregó Laura. Y, cream, después de haber estado del otro lado, puedo deciros que Bart no es tan fuerte como Paris cuando se enfrenta a mujeres que ya no le temen. María se levantó entonces, estirando su espalda cansada. Necesito hacer una última cosa antes de comenzar con todo esto. ¿Qué cosa? Pregunt, aunque sospechaba la respuesta. Necesito enfrentar a Bart. No por él, sino por mí. Necesito decirle todas las cosas que he guardado durante años. Necesito que sepa que ya no tiene poder sobre mí. Laura y yo intercambiamos miradas preocupadas. No ir sola, agregó María, notando nuestra preocupación. Las necesito allí conmigo, no para protegerme, sino para recordarme quién soy ahora, quién siempre fui antes de que él me convenciera de lo contrario. Asentimos en silencio. El sol ya estaba completamente arriba cuando salimos de mi apartamento, tres mujeres unidas por el dolor, pero fortalecidas por la determinación. Mientras bajábamos en el ascensor, María tomó nuestras manos. Gracias, dijo simplemente. Por mostrarme que a veces las peores traiciones pueden llevar a las mejores alianzas. El ascensor llegó a la planta baja y las puertas se abrieron un nuevo día, un día que marcaría el comienzo de nuestra verdadera historia. La casa que compartí con Bart durante 5 años se alzaba frente a nosotros, imponente y fría en la luz del amanecer. María respiró profundamente antes de insertar la llave en la cerradura. Sus manos temblaban ligeramente, pero su rostro mostraba una determinación que nunca lo había visto antes. ¿Estás segura de esto? Preguntó suavemente, poniendo una mano sobre su hombro. Más segura que nunca, respondió, empujando la puerta. El interior de la casa estaba en silencio, pero las luces de la cocina estaban encendidas. Podíamos escuchar el sonido de tazas tintineando y el aroma del café recién hecho flotaba en el aire. Bart siempre había sido madrugador. María, su voz llegó desde la cocina, seguida por el sonido de pasos acercándose. ¿Dónde has estado? He estado lamando toda la. Se detuvo en seco al vernos a las 3 de pie en el vestíbulo. Su rostro pasó de la preocupación al shock y finalmente a la ira cuando sus ojos se posaron en Laura. ¿Qué es esto? Preguntó, su voz tensa. ¿Qué están haciendo ellos aquí? Están aquí porque yo los pedí, respondió María, su voz sorprendentemente firme. Necesitamos hablar, Bart. Sobre todo. sobre todo, Rapitio L, soltando una risa amarga. ¿Te refieres a como mi hermano y mi examante han envenenado tu mente contra mí? Maria dio un paso adelante. Me refiero a como me has estado manipulando durante años, a como has usado mi amor y mi lealtad para controlarme, a como has destruido cada sueño que he tenido, convenciéndome de que los tuyos eran más importantes. Bart palideció, pero rápidamente recuperó su compostura. Maria, cariño, estás alterada. Es el embarazo, las hormonas. No te atrevas, la voz de Maria cortó el air como un latigo. No te atrevas a usar a mi hijo para manipularme otra vez. Se movió hacia las escaleras, hacia el dormitorio principal, con Laura y yo siguiéndola de cerca. Bart intentó bloquear su camino, pero la mirada en los ojos de Maria lo hizo retroceder. ¿Qué estás haciendo? Preguntó, siguiéndonos mientras Maria comenzaba a sacar maletas del armario. Me voy, Bart, respondió ella, comenzando a llenar las maletas con ropa y objetos personales. Y esta vez es para siempre. No puedes irte, su voz temblaba ahora entre la súplica y la amenaza. Estás embarazada. ¿Qué dirá la gente? ¿Qué dirán mis padres? ¿Tus padres? Maria se giró para enfrentarlo, sus ojos brillando con lágrimas contenidas. Los mismos que sabían de tu aventura con Laura y decidieron ocultarlo. Lo admito, pero podemos superarlo, por el bebé. El bebé merece una madre fuerte, lo interrumpió Maria. Una madre que se respeta a sí misma, una madre que lo enseña que el amor no debe doler, que la lealtad no significa sometimiento. Mientras hablaba, continuaba empujando, sus movimientos cada vez más seguros. Laura y yo nos movimos por la habitación, ayudándola a recoger sus pertenencias, formando una barrera silenciosa.